Thank you. All right, so review of last week of Sunday's cards. Number 34, Paul was blinded near where? Damascus, all right. Why was he near Damascus? All right, he was going to Damascus to persecute Christians. Damascus is located where in relation to Galilee? Yeah, a little bit north. All right, a few miles north there. All right, card 35. Paul went from Damascus to Arabia. And that's found in Galatians chapter 1, verse 17, the only mention of that. And we don't know anything further about it. This was shortly after his conversion. He was converted in Damascus. So he went to Arabia apparently to preach. All right. Number 36, the home of Cornelius. Home of Cornelius. Caesarea. All right, where's Caesarea located at? There's more than one of them, but the one Cornelius lived in is located where? Just give me an approximation. Well, it's in Palestine. It's on the coast of what? Mediterranean Sea, right? Who built the city of Caesarea? Who? Herod built the city of Caesarea. Herod the Great, a.k.a. Herod the Baby Killer. All right. Where Peter saw a vision? Joppa. What was in that vision? In the vision. Lane, what was in the vision? What? Why not? What was in the vision? What did Peter see in the vision? Somebody help me out here. Mary Jo, what did he see in the vision? Yeah, it was a sheep. What kind of animals were there in Bible context? Clean and unclean, right? So the message was that Peter, all these animals are now okay for you to eat. Previously, the Jews would have not eaten those that were unclean, only those that were clean. So the message is now those are either can be consumed. All right. So what else what was the even greater, further message of that? All right. The kingdom of Christ was now open to the Gentiles. It was open from Pentecost, but this was the official opening, right? Public, official, everybody signal for the disciples and early church leaders to take the gospel to the Gentiles. All right, Barnabas found Paul or Saul where? Tarsus. What was Tarsus in relation to Paul? What's that? All right, his birthplace, his hometown. Tarsus is in what New Testament country? Huh? Today it's Turkey, but then it was Cilicia was a province of Asia Minor. All right, Cilicia, a province in the country of New Testament times country of Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. All right, church that sent Paul and Barnabas. Antioch in Syria. All right. What church? This is the what? The first missionary tour, right? So the church in Antioch is going to send them on the first missionary tour. What church sent them on the second missionary tour? Trick question. Antioch over here. I got a person mouthing Antioch, but not quite confident to say it. But it is Antioch. What church sent them on the third missionary tour? Antioch. All right. That's kind of like the question a few quarters ago. I can't remember the question, but the answer is Jesus. And Jesus. It was asked, what was the question? All right, it was the kids. the kids have less cards than the adults, and a bunch of the answers in a row were Jesus. So pretty easy to get that belt. All right. Port where Paul left for Cyprus. Port where begins with S. Seleucia back here. All right, it's on the coast of what? Mediterranean Sea, right? It's close to what city? She's not paying attention. Antioch. So any question, you just throw out Antioch if you don't have any else to go with there. All right, what happened to false prophets at Paphos? All right, they were blinded by Paul. Why was the false prophet blinded? Because he tried to do what? Prevent Paul from teaching the gospel. All right, to the governor there. All right, thank you. All right, let's look at Acts chapter 9. We're just going to review a few of the things that we talked about Sunday, not all of them. I'm not going to have a screenshot tonight. We're just going to talk about them. And so we're going from the previous lesson where lesson 4, where Jesus was crucified, the church was started. Now we're in the early days of the church, and we're going to almost skip through Peter, very close, and the other apostles, and go straight to Paul by the end of this lesson in the first missionary tour. All right, so last Sunday we looked a little bit at Acts 9 and beginning in verse 3. If you want to turn over there, that'd be great. Acts 9, verse 3. We'll refresh on that. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, that is Paul, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said unto him, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said, Arise, and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. And Saul rose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man. But they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. All right, so who in this context appeared to Paul? Jesus appeared to him. Caused Paul to be what? Blinded, all right? By the sight of Jesus, apparently. Verse 6, he's told to go into the city and do what? Yep. He's told to go. Ananias is going to find him, but he's told to go and wait until Ananias finds him. Ananias is going to tell him what? What to do. All right? So we see from that in the New Testament context that people who were converted were told by another preacher or teacher, whoever it might be. He wasn't told directly by Jesus what to do, but one taught him. And we'll see that in another conversion in a little bit. All right, no different than what happens today, right? Although there are people that claim other experiences, but that's not how we learn what Jesus wants us to do. We read it in the Bible, or someone teaches us. Look at verses 10 through 12. And there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him said the Lord in a vision, Ananias? And he said, Behold, I am here, Lord. And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the street which is called Straight, and inquire in the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for behold, he prayeth. And he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him, that he might receive his sight. So who was sent to Saul or Paul? Ananias. And it points out here that he was to go to a street called Straight. I read somewhere while studying for this that street is like the longest, straightest street in the old part of Damascus. It's still clearly known where that is. I don't know if it goes by the same name or not, but it's still, you can go to the same street. It's been the same place. It's been known what street that was for 2,000 years. Like in Jerusalem, it's been rubble's been buried so many different times with so many different conflicts. They don't know exactly what street's what in the city hardly, but this street, I understand, is the same as it was. Probably different buildings, but it's the same street, same place 2,000 years ago. Verses 13 and 14, and then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard by many of this man how much evil he hath done to thy saints at Jerusalem, and here he hath authority from the chief priests to bind all that call upon thy name. So, what had Saul heard? What? He was an evil guy because he did what? All right, he imprisoned Christians. He had consented to the death of Stephen and had built on that reputation since that time. So Ananias questions the Lord just a bit to make sure. I think he's questioning just to make sure he understood that right. He doesn't refuse to go, but he's making sure he's got that one right. Verses 15 and 16. Somebody want to read that for me? 15 and 16.
But the Lord said unto him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake.
All right, so he's going to go to who? 3 different people he mentions here, 3 different kinds of people. Gentiles, kings, and the Jews, the children of Israel. So when he goes on these 3 missionary tours, he's going to be going to countries that are predominantly what? They're going to be predominantly Gentile. He's going to go, when he goes there, he's going to first go to the synagogues, and there'll be Jewish people there. But Asia Minor, Greece, and then Rome and Italy are primarily Gentile countries. They're Gentile countries at that time, and there will be a lot of Jews already scattered there, practicing Jewish religion. And in some cases, there were already churches in some of those places, as we said, as in Rome. Before Paul gets there, there's already a church. All right, what kings is he going to go before? Looking ahead a little bit, anybody know? Agrippa. He's going to go, who else? Felix, Festus, Agrippa. That is, those are rulers in Judea and Galilee and Palestine. And then he's going to go to where after that? He appeals to Caesar and he goes to where? Rome. So we believe because he appealed to Caesar that he went before Caesar. He went before Nero. Caesar is the thought that Nero would have been the correct Caesar at the time Paul would have gone to Rome on his appeal. All right, and then in verse 16 it says it's going to show him what great things he will suffer. I made a note here in my Bible to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. You want to turn over there real quick? We'll read this text quickly. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Verse 24. Verse 24, this is Paul speaking of the Jews. 5 times I received 40 stripes, save one. So this is where the Jews whipped their prisoners to get them to confess to whatever they wanted. If they were Gentile, if they were non-Jews, they got 39 stripes. If they were Jews, if they were Jews, they got 39. If they were Gentiles, they got 40. All right, verse 25. Thrice I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck, a night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the heathen, in perils of the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, and in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Beside those things which are without, which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. All right, so Paul recounts the things that he had suffered while taking the gospel to all these Gentile lands at the time he writes that over the past 25 or so years. All right, so that gives us an idea of what God had planned for him. So we're reading back here, if we go back to Acts chapter 9, we're reading the account of Paul's conversion, where he recounts that conversion in 2 chapters. We've studied that when we were studying Acts. We ought to try to remember that. I think it was a question, at least one previous Engraving Heavenly Truth study, maybe twice. So it would be chapters what? 9, 22, and 26. 9, 22, and 26. So here in 9 is the account as it occurred. 22 is when Paul later recounts it to the Gentiles. And then 26, chapter 26, is when he recounts it to Agrippa. So if we look at 26 just for a moment, Acts chapter 26 and verse 13. He's talking to Agrippa. It says, "At midday, O king, I saw in the way a light from heaven above the brightness of the sun shining round about me and them which journeyed with me. And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard a voice speaking unto me, and saying in the Hebrew tongue, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And I said, Who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. But arise and stand up on thy feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness both of these things which thou hast seen, and of those things in the which I will appear unto thee, and delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles whom I now send thee, to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan unto God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among them which are sanctified by faith, which is in me." So Paul is told, Ananias was told what Paul was going to suffer, and then Paul was obviously clearly told what he was going to suffer as he took the gospel to the Gentile world. If we look for a moment, we can also see what Paul was told that he would have to do to be saved if we look at Acts chapter 22. Acts chapter 22, verse 16. 14 through 16, a little more context. And he said, that is Paul, he's preaching to the Jews, the God of our fathers has chosen thee, that thou shouldst know his will, and see that just one, and you should hear the voice of his mouth. For thou shalt be witnesses unto all men of what thou hast seen and heard. This is actually Ananias talking. And now why tarriest thou? Rise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling upon the name of the Lord. So Paul was told by man what he would have to do, that he would have to rise, be baptized, and wash away his sins. That's what Jesus wanted him to do, and that's what Ananias was told to tell him. Paul did that and was converted to Christ. All right, now if we look, if we go on into going back to where we were, Acts chapter 9, and then moving ahead to chapter 10. Somebody want to read Cornelius, Acts chapter 10, verse 1?
A certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band.
All right, centurion was in charge of how many soldiers approximately? 100. And the band was how many? 100 was a part of this band, you may know. I read somewhere it's 600. I assume that's right, about approximately 600. So Cornelius was over 100, and there were obviously about 5 other centurions, I guess, over other groups like that. As we said before, the Rome kept a fairly large contingency in Jerusalem because the Jews were known to rebel quite frequently from the Roman point of view, and so they tried to keep order and peace with their military there. And as we said Sunday, that was true in provinces that were problematic. Rome kept some of their army there to keep order and peace as Rome saw it. If the province was obviously less troublesome, then it was governed by the Senate, and there weren't such a large contingent of soldiers usually. Caesarea, well, as we said, was on the coast of the Mediterranean. It was built by Herod the Great between 10 and 20 BC. So that would have been before Christ was born. I read somewhere that I knew it was a large city. I read somewhere it covered about 8,000 acres by this time. Seems like a huge city. But Herod built it there, and he named it Caesarea for Caesar, of course, and it was a deep water kind of port for commercial purposes. As we said, he built a giant amphitheater there, a large amphitheater, that's still there. It's been restored today, and they use it for outdoor venues and stuff. So there are other things I think you can see there that Herod built, although the harbor is kind of in ruins. It was destroyed in some occupation later on. In verse 2, text says that Cornelius was a devout man and one that feared God with all his house and gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. So if we look at that, he was a devout man. He was one that feared God. So people that fear God believe in God, right? And he gave much alms. He was very generous to the poor, and he prayed to God. So he must have, I'm assuming he had quite a contact or history with the Jewish religion, and he had developed this attitude through observing the Jewish people at that time. Oh, I was also going to point out that we mentioned somewhere that Caesarea was the Romans considered Caesarea to be their capital city of Palestine. The Jews, of course, as I mentioned Sunday, considered Jerusalem to be their capital of Palestine. So that's why Caesarea comes up over and over during this time period, because the Roman governor, or king in the case of Herod was declared by the emperor to be king, and then when he died, they sent Roman governors there. And so, for instance, Pontius Pilate was a Roman governor, and that was his official seat. Herod also had a palace in Jerusalem and in some other cities around Palestine, and he built a very large one in Caesarea. And the governors came along, they inherited those palaces or residences where they were and used them. But the Romans considered Caesarea to be their capital, most important city of Palestine. All right, and that's why there were centurions based out of there. And that's why later, when Paul goes before Felix and Festus, he's taken to Caesarea. And he appears before Agrippa there. All right. Any questions or observations there before I keep going on? So we can draw from this that one of the things I read and makes perfect sense to me, we understand that Cornelius was a devout man and one that feared God. He was not of an idol worshiper. He wasn't of an idolatry persuasion, in other words. And Rome was very big into idolatry, as were the Greeks. The Romans kind of took many of the Greek gods and put a Roman facade on them, shall we say. They converted them to Roman gods and sold them off that way. And that's what the people basically worshipped. But apparently Cornelius was not of that bent. He had given up that idea and had turned to the true and living God. He must have come under some good influences at that time to cause him to want to do that. At the same time, while he was clearly a good man, he was not saved, because what's going to happen? Peter's going to be sent to him to do what? Teach him what to do to be saved, right? So he's a very good man, but he wasn't saved. Looking ahead at next few verses, he saw in a vision, evidently about the 9th hour of the day, an angel of God coming in to him and saying unto him, Cornelius. And when he looked on him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And he said to him, Thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. All right, so Peter is in Joppa, which is 20, 30 miles down the coast, 35 miles down the coast of the Mediterranean from Caesarea. Today, Joppa is, we said Sunday morning that is modern-day Tel Aviv, the largest city today in Palestine. It wasn't then, but today it is. So here we're going to look at Peter in verses 9 through 16 here. I'm not going to read that, but here Peter's going to be told about that great sheet again, right? He's going to see the clean and the unclean animals, and he's going to be told that he can kill and eat. And then in verse 14 he says, Not so, Lord, for I've never eaten anything that's common or unclean. Verse 15, and the voice, I'm reading chapter 10, hope everybody's there. Acts 10, 15. And the voice spake unto him the second time, saying, What God hath cleansed, that call not common. And this was done thrice, and the vessel was received up again into heaven. Why was this done three times? Why does the Bible repeat something? To emphasize it, right? Show that it's important. All right. So why would he need to show this is important to Peter? If you got your Sunday morning sheet, turn over on the back of it, right? We've got our little chart here. Joey's told me every once in a while I'm supposed to look at this chart and talk about it on the back, right? Keep everybody in context here. So I mentioned a few weeks ago, if we turn over there, those 15 periods of Bible history, where were they given the law? What period? Not the law. Yeah, it was given to the patriarchs, but what period here? It was after it wasn't given to Abraham. It was given the wilderness wandering, period 5, right? So before that, it was the patriarchy, but they were given while they were wandering in the wilderness. Moses went to Mount Sinai, got the law from the Lord, from God. And so about what time is that, if you had to estimate? That period started in 1491 BC, right? And now it's about what? What was it when Jesus was resurrected? It was about 30 then. Now we've said Sunday morning this is going to be about 40, right? So it's about 1,500 years ago when they were given the law of Moses. So the Jews have been following this or attempting to follow it for 1,500 years, right? That's a pretty big deal. They considered themselves to be exclusively God's people. That wasn't really exactly the truth, but that's their view on it. And they, most of the time, tried to maintain their how can I say that? Somebody say it. Their exclusiveness, their exclusive, what she said, with the tivity on the end of it. All right? So I couldn't get that one out when I wanted to. So they've been practicing this for 1,500 years, so they're pretty steeped in it. Now, it is true that they way off the reservation during the divided kingdom, that's for sure, and all that stuff. But they've been practicing this for 1,500 years, and they're pretty steeped in it. So The Lord is trying to be really clear with Peter, right? Saying, this is over. You know, I mean, it was over when Jesus fulfilled the law and died on the cross. It was over, but they're still kind of practicing going along here. So he's telling him it's over. You know, that we're not practicing that law anymore. We're practicing the new law, the law of Christ. The Old Testament law was done and finished on the cross. So he's to be very clear with Peter. And did Peter completely get the message? What happens later on? Peter is caught up in what? He's caught up in problems. Paul has to correct him over circumcision, which was a Jewish law, that it had to be practiced in the Christian age and did not. So Peter's still struggling with it after this, and so were the rest of the Jews. The number one problem in the first century was what? I was going to look back here and see if I could get it out of Joey, but he's not. Number one problem in the first century was what, Joey? For the church. Teaching-wise. Judaizing teachers, right? Judaizing teachers, the Jews wanted to bring back in the law of Moses. That was the number one problem that the church faced all throughout the first century. They wanted to bring back some piece part of the law of Moses. And it's all done. It's finished. They were not to practice it as a law anymore. If they wanted to just eat clean animals and wanted to do that without forcing it on everybody else and doing it because it was a religious law, just simply doing it because what they've always done, that would have been certainly acceptable. But it wasn't right to force that any longer as a religious law. All right, looking at how much time I got? Not too much. Acts chapter 10 and verse 19. We're going to skip through a lot of this, just pick up a little bit. I thought it was an interesting verse here I hadn't quite looked at before, but it says in verse 19, while Peter thought on the vision, this is before Cornelius' men arrived to take him back to Caesarea. While Peter thought on the vision, the Spirit said unto him, behold, 3 men seek thee. Arise therefore, and get thee down, and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them. So, interesting here that in verse 19 it says the Spirit's doing the speaking, and in verse 19 it says, I have sent them. That means the Spirit is a person. Just like Jesus, the Son, just like God the Father, the Spirit is a person. And the personality, if you want to, in that way, is one of 3 of the Godhead. All right? And he had to do with bringing instructions to the first century church in this context. Looking at verse 22, and they said, the 3 men that come to get Peter, Cornelius the centurion, a just man and one that feareth God, and of a good report among all the nations of the Jews, was warned from God by a holy angel to send for thee into his house, and to hear words of thee. So, what is Cornelius? My point is, Cornelius is going to be taught by a man too. He's going to be taught by Peter. The Spirit wants Peter to go there and teach Cornelius. The Spirit's not going to tell Cornelius what to do to be saved. Jesus is not going to tell him what to do to be saved. But someone will go and teach him what to do to be saved. All right? I'm going to run out of time here, I do believe. In verse 33, immediately therefore I sent to thee, this is Cornelius speaking, and thou hast well done that thou art come. Now therefore we are all here present before God to hear all things that are commanded of God. They wanted to hear God's commands. All right, and then Peter opened his mouth and said, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted of him. The word which God sent unto the children of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ, he is Lord of all. And then all right, so Cornelius will be in verses 47 and 48. Can any man forbid water that these should not be baptized, which have received the Holy Ghost as well as I? And he commanded them to be baptized in the name of the Lord, and then prayed they him to tarry certain days. So he baptized them in the name of Jesus because they believed in Jesus, because they'd heard his message. They clearly repented of their sins and believed Jesus was the Christ. So Peter baptized these Gentiles, and then he goes back to Jerusalem in chapter 11 and declares what God had shown him in the vision and what he had done to Cornelius, that is, baptized him into the church as a Gentile. And then we're going to look at 11:19, chapter 11. Looking at verse 19, now they which were scattered abroad upon the persecution that arose about Stephen traveled as far as, that should be Phoenicia. It says Phinis in the King James, but it's really Phoenicia, and Cyprus and Antioch, preaching the word to none but the Jews only. So what we learn from this is that from the time of Stephen, which was back in Acts chapter 6 and 7, and when Stephen was stoned, killed, martyred, that the Jews spread out from Jerusalem. You remember Acts chapter 1, verse 8, gospel will go from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the rest of the world. So after Stephen is killed, Jewish Christians go to Phoenicia, which is Tyre and Sidon on the coast of the Mediterranean, just above Caesarea. And they go to Cyprus, which is that first island out in the Mediterranean we talked about a little bit Sunday. And then also into Antioch, that is Antioch of Syria, preaching the word. But only to Jews. And then in verse 20 it says, and some of them were men of Cyprus and Cyrene, which when they were come to Antioch, spake unto the Grecians, preaching the Lord Jesus Christ. So some Christians, such as Barnabas was from Cyprus, but it doesn't say he's one of these, but probably was, because he's in the context right below that. They come and they began preaching to the Gentiles at this time in Antioch. Antioch is at that time the third largest city in the Roman Empire. It has about 500,000 people. It was extremely large, modern city then. It's just a few miles on the Orontes River up the coast off the Mediterranean up from the port of Seleucia. We mentioned all those things already. Then in 11 in verse 21, and the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number believed and turned to the Lord. So we see that belief is associated with turning to the Lord. They turned away from what they were doing that was not toward the Lord, and they turned toward the Lord. Then in verses 11 and 25, chapter 11, 25 and 26, and when he had found him, that is, Barnabas is looking for Paul in Tarsus, I skipped a verse, 25. Then departed Barnabas to Tarsus for to seek Paul. And when he had found him, he brought him unto Antioch, and it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people, and the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. Oh, you can't do that. I'm not finished. All right, we'll keep going for just a minute. So if we look over in verse 28, put it in a time context. Some had asked about some of the times, and we see in verse 28, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be a great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. One of the questions I'm going to ask, don't have time for you to look it up, but when was Claudius Caesar emperor? Well, the time chart I handed out last week puts him at 41 AD to 54 AD. All right? Then if we look down at 12, verse 1, we see, now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. So this is Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great. He ruled from 37 AD to 44 AD. So if we overlap those two times, these events have to be occurring to have both those emperors between 41 and 44. Probably here in 44, because it's believed that Paul started the second missionary journey in AD 45. All right? So that's where we're going to leave it. The last question or two is talking about the first missionary journey. And we set up that context for this coming week. First missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas starts in AD 45. We'll talk about that more Sunday morning. Thank you.